The social, political, and economic aspects of the Roaring Twenties. Prohibition. The era of Prohibition was first ushered in 1919 when the 18th Amendment was first ratified in the U.S. Constitution. The Volstead Act also enforced the new amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages. This new law was supported by crusading churches and the many wives of drunken husbands. The south and western part of the country also favored the prohibition laws. Southern whites wanted to keep alcohol away from the blacks to prevent any unwanted outbursts, and the western prohibition laws attacked the ever-present culture of the saloon: public drunkenness, prostitution, crime, and immorality. Although the Dry Amendment had its supporters, it also had significant resistance, particularly in the eastern cities. Numerous wet, foreign-born citizens had grown accustomed to their traditions of socializing in taverns or beer gardens, but with the new laws this became nearly impossible. Prohibitionists assumed this new era would last indefinitely, but were rudely awakened by the realization that the federal government has weak control within private homes, and that federal authorities couldn't enforce a law that the general population didn't support. This led to a sharp increase in crimes such as bootlegging, gangsterism, and the replacement of saloons to secret speakeasies. The new youth culture. Along with this, the social norms of the younger generation, especially young women, began to open free with the decade's new prosperity. Shocking their elders, young women began to cut their hair shorter and elevate their hemlines, which exposed their legs and knees. These women became known as flappers, which became a symbol of that era's revolution. Sustained with the nation's wealth, the young people threw boisterous parties, drank illegal liquor, and danced sexually suggestive moves to jazz music. The rebellious generation coincided with jazz music, which led to new dances such as the Charleston, one-step, and the popular foxtrot. Political aspects. Warren Harding. President Warren Harding served in office in 1921 to 1923. Well-liked and widely known for his kindness and love of people, Harding served a predominantly conservative, pro-business Republican plan. Harding had also appointed skillful cabinet members who he promised to be the best minds during his term. These people included Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, and Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. Though he put together a successful group of cabinet members, it was weakened by individuals who were accused of misconduct. Secretary of the Interior Senator Albert B. Fall and Harry M. Daugherty, as Attorney General, had used their official positions for personal gain. One particular hot scandal that caught in the nation's attention after Harding's death was the Teapot Dome scandal. In this, Albert B. Fall rented public lands to oil companies in exchange for gifts and personal loans. The Teapot Dome scandal had tarnished Harding's reputation after his death, though before he was admired during his short term. Excluding the wrongdoing within the Harding administration, the president had had many accomplishments, including reducing taxes, enacting high protective tariffs, and limiting immigration within the country. He had also appointed 4 out of the 9 justices in the judicial court, and also chose ex-President Taft as Chief Justice. In the summer of 1923, Harding embarked on a tour across the country to promote his policies when he suddenly got fatally ill with pneumonia and thrombosis and died on August 2, 1923. Early the next morning, Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn into the office as the 30th President of the United States. President Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge stood in stark contrast with his predecessor's personality. His somber nature, real honesty, and determination to clean up the fraud within the Harding administration made him a broadly popular president. One of Coolidge's first acts as president was to appoint a council to investigate the Teapot Dome scandal and dismiss the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, and Attorney General Harry Daugherty. In the presidential election of 1924, Coolidge won over the Democratic candidate John Davis and Progressive Party candidate Robert La Follette. The new president's policies followed a strong principle in small government and private enterprise. Like Harding, he continued to reduce federal taxes, limit government spending, and use a hands-off approach to business. The Coolidge era also continued further naval disarmament and rejected U.S. membership in the League of Nations, resulting in continued isolationism. Overall, President Coolidge led the nation through most of the Roaring Twenties, providing stability for the rapidly changing American culture. In the 1928 presidential election, Coolidge had bowed out of the candidacy and was replaced by his successor, Herbert Hoover. President Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover won the 1928 presidential election against Democratic candidate Alfred Smith. In the early stages of his new presidency, the nation's prosperity flourished abundantly with the exception of the farming communities. To help the impoverished farmers, the Hoover administration passed the Agricultural Marketing Act, which was legislated to help farmers help themselves through producers' cooperatives. Soon enough, the new president couldn't stop the dark economic storm that was going to affect the lives of millions of Americans. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed and millions of citizens lost their jobs and their families went hungry. At first, Hoover was conflicted with how he should deal with this disaster because of his known reputation as a humanitarian, yet he also supported rugged individualism, which didn't advocate government handouts because he feared that if the government was doling out doles, it would weaken the national fiber. But as the Depression worsened, he was reluctantly forced to abandon his doctrine of individualism and accept that the well-being of the people in a nationwide catastrophe is a direct concern of the national government. To start off his new plan, Hoover recommended that Congress vote vast sums for useful public works, which totaled to be $2.25 million. First, he assisted the railroads, bank, and rural credit corporations to coincide with his trickle-down effect. He also established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, which was a government lending bank for insurance companies, banks, and agricultural businesses. Although Hoover did what he could, the Depression worsened and critics portrayed Hoover unfairly, thus resulting in him being deeply unpopular and losing the 1932 presidential election to Democratic candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt. Economic aspects. Mass consumptionism. After World War I, the American industry needed new markets to sustain the production of goods. American manufacturers had no problem producing the goods with faster and more efficient assembly lines, and now needed to focus on consumption. The advertising industry, using persuasion, sexual suggestion, and seduction, sought to bring in consumers and make them buy more and more than they really needed. This was used in the automobile industry, which especially flourished in the 1920s with over 30 million cars owned by the common citizen in America. Henry Ford's perfected assembly line, known as Fordism, made it so that his cars could be mass-produced hastily. This method was so economical that the average American could buy a Ford Roadster for $260, well within a common worker's budget. The rapid growth of the automobile industry also created other supporting businesses, such as rubber, glass, fabric, highway construction, gas stations, and garages. Other effects were also widely felt in markets, with speedy transportation of fresh fruits to all parts of the country. American families also indulged in other material devices, such as the radio and movie theaters, which modernized the new American way of life. The Great Depression. The 1920s era was rather a prosperous time for the nation until October 1929, when the stock market plummeted. On that fateful day, the stock market bubble finally exploded when a record of 12.9 billion shares were sold. This day was known as Black Thursday. Yet 5 days later, on Black Tuesday, another 16 million shares were traded, which resulted in the stock market collapse. This had a ripple effect on factories and other businesses when consumers stopped spending and investing, which stalled production and construction, thus leading to firing their workers. By 1931, 6 million people were unemployed and couldn't find any work. The upsurge in the unemployment and homelessness led to bread lines and soup kitchens. Farmers who were already struggling with their own economic depression due to drought and reduced food prices couldn't afford to harvest crops and were forced to let them rot in fields while people elsewhere starved. Banks were also having waves of panic, causing them to close their doors to the public. More than 5,000 banks failed within the first 3 years of the stock market collapse. The cause of the Great Depression can be the explanation of overproduction in both farm and factory industries. The nation tended to produce more goods than it could consume or pay for. Also, uncontrolled credit spending, heavy consumer debt, and the financial collapse in war-torn Europe, and the drought in the Mississippi Valley all contributed to the cause of the Depression.